War was one of the most violent conflicts that the world had ever seen. With a global death count in the millions, the fallen in the war would eventually gain a tragic yet heroic legacy. But is the legacy accurate or just a result of biased rhetoric? To answer this question, I'll be looking at physical representations of the fallen's memory, particularly the cenotaph, the Royal Artillery Memorial, and the Imperial War Museum. The cenotaph in Whitehall, London, is a stone pillar designed by Edwin Lutyens between 1919 and 1920. Its design mainly composes of Roman elements such as stone wreaths and war dates on two sides, and the engraved phrase, "The Glorious Dead." On the other two faces, several British flags are used to represent military factions who fought in the war. The design of the cenotaph is remarkably simplistic for a war memorial, but perhaps this lack of ornateness falls in line with Professor George L. Moss's work, The Cult of the Fallen Soldier. In this work, he argues that remembrance of soldiers from World War I turns into taking their unknown deaths and reshaping them to fit the heroic ideas of the nation they died for, a phenomenon he called the myth of the war experience. It's possible that the creator of this monument decided on a less human-centered design to avoid leveraging the dead to put Britain in a positive light. But there are elements of the monument that do perpetuate an elevated view of the common soldier. The Glorious Dead engraving on the cenotaph fits Moss's idea of exalting the fallen. The use of the word glorious signifies an extreme admiration, almost to a religious point. Moss touches upon this point with his example of nations using mythological features on the tombstones to resurrect the dead and fuel the fire of the nation. By deifying the common soldier and ignoring the brutality of war, the real tragedy of death is nullified. While the idea behind the engraving on the cenotaph is meant to capture the sacrifice of World War I soldiers, it neglects to incorporate a more human aspect, making the monument seem very sanitized. Death and war are not glorious, but tragic factors of the human condition. Another notable feature on the cenotaph is the contrast between the national flags and a Roman art style. Though some argued that the Roman numerals and wreath were reminiscent of paganism, they were left on the memorial. Moss claims that Roman elements signified dignity and glory of war. The cenotaph, like many other monuments during the Great War, again fall into the pattern of molding the idea of war and human sacrifice as an extinct experience. Maybe these attributes were meant to give humanity justification for suffering through such chaos. Still, there is the question of whether individual sacrifice is being memorialized accurately or just being used to prop up a nation's role in the war. The next monument I'd like to discuss is the Royal Artillery Memorial. Created in the 1920s by World War I veteran Charles Jagger, it gained a large amount of positive and negative attention for its direct imagery of soldiers from the war. The bronze statues of combatants in particular reshapes the definition of a traditional war memorial. The most controversial aspect of Jagger's piece is the statue of the fallen soldier. According to Jonathan Black, a researcher of the arts at Kingston University, Jagger's main goal with the memorial was to display soldiers in a unique yet often overlooked light, and show the reality of war that he saw as a soldier on the front lines. The amount of realism in the sculpture, from the folds on the jacket to the tracks on the boots, show a level of individuality not felt in the cenotaph. Additionally, by covering the soldier's face, Jagger shows a quiet respect for the dead. The soldier, while not having an identity, could have been anyone from a high-ranking official to a common foot soldier. But his death, and the important individuality of it, is still placed front and center. However, the backlash Jagger received over this monument being too graphic shows conflict between soldiers telling their own stories versus the desired input of those who are left behind. Jagger didn't always stick to the same methods of sculpting the fallen. Many of his pieces, particularly of artillerymen, emphasize masculine features and dynamic poses to represent the force, strength, and protection Jagger felt when fighting beside his comrades. Some could argue that the sculptures feed into perceptions of the dead being godlike, but Jagger displays several sides of the common soldier to the general public and breaks out of the same sentimental patterns in traditional memorials. It's not bad to see soldiers as powerful or brave. The problem arises when those experiences are more prized than others, and the complexity of the soldiers' and civilians' stories of the Great War are forgotten. The Imperial War Museum demonstrates modern society's relationship with the Great War. Opened in 1917, it served as a marker of the British Empire's role in the war, but in 2012 it underwent changes to its World War I exhibit that represents different nations' contributions during wartime. In this display are the uniforms of Russian, French, Austro-Hungarian, and German soldiers. Perhaps the most interesting factor is that this exhibit, along with many of the other changes in the museum, stray away from a Britain-centered outlook to provide a more equal narrative of World War I. The uniforms are all on the same level, with no apparent villainization or glorification being present. Though this exhibit doesn't directly show the soldiers, it provides a neutral approach that does not pigeonhole the complex roles of nations into a good guy versus bad guy situation, and it respects the memory of those who lived and died with these uniforms, regardless of their nationality. The soldier cutouts and reenacted footage placed on top of it was a visually striking piece. Personally, with most of the exhibits in the museum, I felt a sense of distance because it seemed to be another tragic event from the past. Harry Mount's article, How Should We Remember the First World War?, uncovers that most people in the modern era tend to think of World War I as just a disaster. This oversimplification and our lack of experiencing the unique wartime makes us feel distanced, so we try to reclaim that lost emotion by forcing ourselves to feel somber. With this exhibit, however, hearing the voices and seeing the human beings made the war all too real. While the video was horrifying in its own right, it made me feel more sympathetic to the people that experience carnage firsthand. While informing the public is a factor in helping modern society remember the Great War, perhaps playing upon human emotion is key in making us realize why we should care about remembering the fallen. The past few weeks of research have made me understand the value of the Great War to our world's history, while also making me realize the relevance of the fallen to the past and the present. I now realize that World War I emphasized the multifaceted nature of both the soldier and the civilians caught in the conflict. To neglect this fact means repeating the same cycle of memorials who glorify death or simplify the sides in the conflict. If we don't re-examine our remembrance of the dead, we will move further and further away from a more accurate rendition of wartime.